After the twins were born, he started traveling all the time, and I stayed home, alone, taking care of 3 little souls and losing myself in the process. He stopped talking to me, stopped touching me, stopped seeing me. I became invisible in my own home, a ghost with a heartbeat. I thought he was just tired from work. But the truth was he was tired of me. My name is Sophia, and there was a time when silence became louder than any scream I had ever heard. It was the kind of silence that crawled beneath the skin, that made every breath feel heavy with unanswered questions. It began after the twins were born. The night they arrived, everything felt surreal. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and new beginnings. My husband stood beside me, his hands cold but his voice steady. He told me I had been strong. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we were still a team, that bringing 2 new lives into the world would make us closer. For a moment it did. The twins were perfect. Tiny, fragile, wrapped in soft white blankets, they seemed to carry all the light I had left. Our toddler, unaware of how much life had changed, looked at them with wide curiosity. I remember thinking, this is the family I dreamed of. But dreams dissolve quietly, sometimes without warning. Within weeks, he began traveling again for work. I told myself it was necessary, that he was doing it for us. The company needed him, and I needed to be understanding. So I stayed home, surrounded by bottles, diapers, and a house that echoed with the cries of 3 children under 3 years old. I barely slept. My body hurt, my mind blurred, and yet I kept going because mothers do not stop. We cannot. Every morning, I woke before sunrise to feed the babies, prepare breakfast for our toddler, clean bottles, fold tiny clothes, and try to look human before the day collapsed into exhaustion. But the hardest part was not the work. It was him. He stopped talking to me. Not gradually, but completely, as if someone had switched off a light inside him. He still came home between trips. He still ate the food I cooked, and he still reached for me at night when he wanted to. But the man who once shared every thought, every small joy or frustration, now moved through the house like a stranger. No good mornings, no goodbyes, no questions, no laughter. I asked him what was wrong. I asked gently at first, then desperately. He looked through me, not at me. He would shrug, walk away, or sometimes sigh as if my words were too heavy to carry. I tried everything I could think of. Notes in his suitcase when he traveled. Messages he never replied to. I even tried silence myself, hoping maybe he would miss my voice. He did not. There is a special kind of loneliness that exists in marriage. A loneliness that comes from sleeping next to someone who has emotionally disappeared. It is not like being alone. Being alone can be peaceful. This was suffocating. At night, when the babies cried in turns and my body trembled from exhaustion, I used to imagine his voice beside me, the one that had once said, "You are my home." But now my home was full of noise yet empty of warmth. I remember one evening vividly. The twins were 3 months old. He had returned from a trip, tired, distracted, scrolling through his phone while I fed the babies. I told him the pediatrician wanted to see them again for a checkup. He nodded without lifting his eyes. I asked if he could come with me. He said nothing. Later, as I rocked one of the babies to sleep, I caught my reflection in the window. My hair was tied back, my eyes swollen with fatigue. I looked like a ghost of myself. I whispered, "Do you still love me?" The window answered with silence. That was the night I realized love does not always vanish with drama or anger. Sometimes it fades quietly, slipping away between the spaces of routine and distance. I kept waiting for a reason. Maybe stress? Maybe resentment? Maybe I had done something wrong. But no matter how many explanations I built inside my mind, none of them filled the silence he left behind. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. My body healed, but my spirit cracked in places I did not know existed. Every time I saw other couples, laughing in the grocery store, holding hands at the park, I felt something twist inside me. I wanted to ask them, how do you stay connected? What do you do when the person you love stops seeing you? I stopped telling my friends about it. They would say things like, men go through their phases, or maybe he just needs space. But it was not space he wanted. It was absence. He wanted to exist without being seen, without responsibility for the emotional wreckage he was leaving behind. Sometimes I blame myself. Maybe I had become too tired, too irritable, too consumed by motherhood. Maybe he missed the woman I used to be, carefree, smiling, full of energy. But how could I be her again when every day felt like a test of endurance? One night, after putting the children to sleep, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the last time he had really looked at me. Not out of obligation or habit, but with affection. I could not recall. That realization broke something inside me. It was not anger. It was grief. I grieved the version of us that had once existed. The couple who laughed in the kitchen, who dreamed together, who promised to always talk things through. Now, I lived with a stranger who shared my last name but not my heart. That was the beginning of the unraveling, the slow, silent death of connection that no one else could see. Outwardly, we looked fine. The pictures on social media still showed smiles. The neighbors still waved when he left for work. But behind those closed doors, I was disappearing. And the most terrifying part was that he did not even notice. For 2 years, I lived like a shadow. I moved through the house quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had replaced love. I spoke only when necessary. I smiled for the children. I cooked. I cleaned. I managed every small detail of our lives as if by doing everything perfectly, I could somehow bring him back. But he remained distant, emotionally absent, physically present only in fragments. Sometimes he would leave early in the morning, saying he had work trips, and I would pretend to believe him. Pretending became easier than facing the truth that something was terribly wrong. I kept telling myself that maybe he was under pressure, that maybe his silence was his way of coping. But late at night, when the children were asleep and the house was dark, I could feel the emptiness in his presence. It was the kind of void that made every heartbeat sound like an echo. I prayed for clarity, but when it finally came, it destroyed me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary, quiet, forgettable. He had come home early, saying he needed to rest before another trip. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I noticed him in the corner of my eye. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back turned toward me, holding his phone unusually close to his chest. His movements were tense, secretive. I asked casually, "Who are you texting?" He looked startled, then forced a laugh. "Just work." But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered with the same nervousness I had once seen in our toddler when he tried to hide a broken toy behind his back. Something inside me shifted. After he left the room, I stood there frozen. My pulse pounded in my ears. My hands trembled. And for the first time in years, anger began to burn through the fog of numbness. That night, after he fell asleep, I reached for his phone. My heart raced so loudly that I feared it would wake him. I had never checked his phone before, partly out of trust, partly out of pride. But that night, pride had no meaning. The screen lit up, and within seconds, my world began to collapse. There were dating applications, multiple. Profiles with his photo, his smile, his words. The man who no longer spoke to me had been talking to dozens of women. Messages filled with flirtation, promises, and explicit conversations. Photographs. Payments for meetups. Bookings for hotels in cities where he had claimed to be working. I scrolled through the messages in disbelief, each one cutting deeper than the last. I saw the dates, birthdays, anniversaries, even the night I had been in the hospital with one of the twins. He had been messaging another woman while I was sending him updates about our child's fever. My breath broke. My knees gave out, and I sat on the cold floor with the phone still in my hand, staring at the proof of everything I had refused to see. The silence I had been drowning in for 2 years suddenly made sense. It had not been confusion. It had been guilt. It had been deceit wrapped in indifference. I wanted to scream, but the children were sleeping in the next room. So I pressed my hand over my mouth and cried in silence, the kind of crying that feels like a wound tearing open inside your chest. For hours I read through everything. His lies were meticulous. He had different names, different stories, different versions of himself for each woman. Some of them believed he was single. Others knew he was married but did not care. One of them had sent a message that said, "Your wife must be lucky. Does she know how good you are at pretending?" That line stayed with me. By dawn, I could no longer tell if the trembling in my body was from anger or grief. The man sleeping in the next room was not my husband. He was a stranger wearing his face. When the sun rose, I made coffee as usual. I dressed the children, packed lunches, and smiled as if nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. I looked at him while he ate, and for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the man I had loved, but as the man who had abandoned me long before he touched another woman. I did not confront him that morning. I could not. The words were too heavy to form. I needed to breathe first, to think, to understand how to rebuild a life that had just shattered. The following days passed in a blur. Every moment felt like a performance. I laughed with the children, talked to neighbors, went through routines, but my mind replayed every image, every message, every betrayal. I kept wondering how long he had been living this double life. How many lies had he told me with that calm, emotionless voice? How many times he had looked at me knowing he was already somewhere else? And yet, beneath all the rage and humiliation, there was something worse: shame. I felt ashamed that I had stayed blind for so long, that I had begged for affection from someone who had already chosen to love others. I felt small, foolish, and humiliated. But shame is a strange thing. Once it burns through you, it leaves space for something stronger. One night, after putting the twins to sleep, I stood in front of the mirror. My reflection looked older, but there was a new kind of fire in my eyes, the kind that comes from seeing the truth and surviving it. I whispered to myself, "You will not disappear anymore." For years I had become a shadow in my own home. Now I could finally see the outlines of my pain, and within it, the shape of my strength. That was the night I decided I would no longer beg for answers. I did not need to understand his reasons. I only needed to understand myself, what I wanted, what I deserved, and who I could become after losing everything I thought I was. Because sometimes the greatest betrayal is not the one that breaks your heart. It is the one that forces you to find it again. I finally understood that he had never been loyal. He had been deceiving me from the very beginning. Every trip, every excuse, every business meeting, they had all been built on lies. His entire world had been a carefully constructed performance, and I had been the silent audience, applauding a man who never existed. That moment felt like falling through glass. The pain was sharp, sudden, and humiliating. I sat on the floor, holding his phone in my hands, surrounded by the quiet chaos of my own disbelief. My reflection shimmered faintly on the black screen, and I whispered, "How could I have been so blind?" It was not just the betrayal that crushed me. It was the realization that I had betrayed myself, that I had silenced my instincts, ignored my own unease, and believed in a fantasy because the truth felt too terrifying. For years I had sensed the distance, the disinterest, the emptiness. but I had kept convincing myself that love could survive anything if I just tried hard enough. Now I could see it clearly. It had never been love. It had been convenience. He had taken advantage of my loyalty, my patience, my willingness to forgive before there was even an apology. He had looked me in the eyes, kissed me goodbye before his trips, and all the while, he had known what he was doing. That was the part that haunted me the most. Not the lies, but the calmness with which he lived them. I walked to the window, still clutching his phone, and looked outside. The city was asleep, the streets quiet, the world untouched by the storm that had just destroyed mine. The twins were breathing softly in their cribs, unaware that their mother's heart had just broken into 1,000 sharp, invisible pieces. My tears came without sound. They streamed down my face until my skin felt raw. I had never felt pain like that, not even in childbirth. Because this pain did not end. It kept expanding inside me, swallowing everything I had built. By the time morning came, I was hollow. I did not confront him immediately. I watched him as he walked through the kitchen, pouring coffee, checking his phone, pretending to be a man living an ordinary morning. I studied his movements, the way his hands moved, the way he avoided my eyes, the faint smile he gave when our toddler ran to hug him. It all looked so normal, and that made it unbearable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone in his face, demand an explanation, break the silence that had ruled our home for too long. But I could not. My voice felt locked somewhere deep inside my chest, buried under the weight of betrayal. Instead, I watched him leave. He kissed our toddler on the forehead, said he would be home late, and walked out the door. The sound of it closing felt final, soft, but heavy, like the end of a prayer that was never answered. When he was gone, I sat on the floor again. The same place, the same phone, but now the tears had dried. All that remained was rage. Not wild, chaotic rage, but something colder, quieter, more focused. The kind that made me feel alive again after years of numbness. For so long, I had been asking myself, what did I do wrong? That morning, for the first time, I stopped asking that question. Because the truth was simple, I did nothing wrong. I had been loyal, patient, kind, forgiving. I had given everything I had, and he had taken it without care. His betrayal was not a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of his emptiness. When he returned that evening, I was waiting. He looked surprised to see me sitting in the living room, the phone placed neatly on the table in front of me. I could see the flicker of panic in his eyes, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He knew. I spoke quietly. I saw everything. He froze. What do you mean? Do not insult my intelligence, I said. I saw the messages, the profiles, the women, the trips, the payments. I saw all of it. He said nothing. His expression was unreadable. No guilt, no remorse, just a dull emptiness. Finally, he muttered, "You should not have gone through my phone." I laughed. Not out of amusement, but disbelief. "That is what you have to say?" I asked. "After everything you have done?" He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said, "Sophia, it is not what you think. Those things do not mean anything." I stared at him. "They mean everything? Because they mean that I was never enough for you. And maybe nothing ever would have been." He said nothing after that. Just silence. The same silence that had been killing our marriage long before I knew why. After a long pause, he said he needed time to think and walked out again. I watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the night, and I realized that this time, I did not care if he came back. For years I had feared losing him. That night I felt relief. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that once used to suffocate me. But now it felt different, cleaner, emptier, but peaceful. The absence of lies had its own kind of comfort. I tucked the children into bed and stood by the window for a long time, watching the sky darken. The stars were faint, almost invisible through the city lights, but I kept looking anyway. Maybe because for the first time in a long while, I felt a strange kind of clarity, as if I could finally see myself again through all the hurt. I whispered softly, "You were blind, but you will not stay blind." That night I began to accept that the man I had loved no longer existed. Maybe he never had. What I loved was the idea of him, the illusion I built to survive the loneliness he created. It was time to let that illusion die, because sometimes the truth is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to set you free. And I was ready to start learning what freedom felt like. It had been 3 days since he left the house. The silence felt heavier than before, but it no longer frightened me. I had stopped checking my phone. I had stopped waiting for footsteps in the hallway. Instead, I focused on breathing, on feeding the children, on remembering how it felt to exist without constantly apologizing for someone else's choices. Each night, when the twins finally slept, I would sit near the window and talk to myself in whispers. I would say, "You are not broken. You were betrayed, but you are not broken." The words became my anchor. On the 4th evening, the doorbell rang. My heart did not race this time. I knew it was him. He walked in with the same casual arrogance he always carried, as if the destruction he caused was something temporary, a storm he could leave behind when the sun returned. He looked around the house, avoiding my eyes, pretending to be searching for something trivial. But I could see it in his face, that restless, hollow expression of a man who had already decided his next move. He cleared his throat and said flatly, "We need to talk." I nodded. "Go ahead." He hesitated, then spoke in a tone that was cold and strangely practiced. "I do not want to continue this marriage anymore. The papers will come to you soon. I will keep seeing the children, but between us, it is over." His words were calm, almost detached, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than ending years of shared life. For a moment, I simply looked at him. The air felt still, thick, unmoving. I had imagined this moment so many times. Him returning, realizing his mistakes, apologizing, saying he wanted to rebuild. I thought he would finally see the pain he had caused. I thought he would finally choose us. But instead, he had chosen escape. "I see," I said quietly. He seemed almost relieved that I did not argue. "It will be easier this way," he continued. "We have both changed. You will understand one day." I let out a faint, humorless laugh. "Understand what? That you destroyed a family and called it change?" He looked away. "I am sorry you see it that way." "No," I said, my voice sharper now. "You are not sorry. You are only uncomfortable. You want freedom, but you do not want guilt. You want to be seen as honest now, after years of deceit. But honesty without remorse is just cruelty in disguise." He frowned but remained silent. For the first time, I realized that his silence no longer had power over me. It used to crush me. Now it only confirmed what I already knew: he was empty. I continued, my voice steady. "I kept waiting for you to come back to your senses. I thought maybe one day you would knock on this door, fall to your knees and say you were sorry. I thought the man I married still existed somewhere beneath all those lies. But I was wrong. That man never existed. He was just a mask." He shifted uncomfortably, then said, "Sophia, please, I do not want to fight." I smiled sadly. "Do not worry. I am not fighting. I am done fighting for someone who never wanted to stay." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "You can go. I do not need to hear more. Send the papers when you are ready. I will sign them." I refused to spend another minute begging for love that was never real. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Confusion, maybe surprise, maybe the faint recognition that the woman standing before him was no longer the same one he could manipulate. He nodded slowly, perhaps realizing that I was not going to cry, not going to plead, not going to ask for explanations. He walked toward the door, paused for a brief moment, then said, "I will see the kids soon." "You are their father," I replied. "They deserve your presence, but I do not." He looked at me one last time, a long, empty stare, and then he left. When the door closed, I exhaled deeply. The sound echoed through the quiet house. For a long time, I stood still, staring at the door, waiting for the familiar ache to rise. But it did not. Instead, there was peace, fragile but real. I walked to the mirror again, the same one where I had once whispered promises to survive. My reflection looked stronger now, not unhurt, but unbroken. My eyes were still red, but there was a new kind of clarity in them. I said softly, "You thought losing him would destroy you. But losing him was the beginning of finding yourself." Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild. I enrolled in an online course I had postponed for years. I started running again in the early mornings, pushing my body until the cold air filled my lungs and reminded me that I was alive. The pain did not vanish, but it became smaller, like a bruise fading beneath sunlight. Sometimes when the twins laughed or my toddler ran into my arms, I felt something warm bloom inside me, a quiet strength I had forgotten I possessed. I realized that love did not leave my life, only the wrong version of it did. I wrote in my journal every night, ending each entry with the same line, "He broke my heart, but he did not break me." There were still hard days, moments when loneliness crept in, when I missed the illusion of companionship, when I wondered why he never chose to stay. But I had learned to answer my own questions. I had learned that closure does not always come from apologies. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. And so I accepted. He was gone. The marriage was over. But I was still here, breathing, standing, healing. One evening, as the sun set beyond the window, painting the sky in soft gold and violet, I whispered to myself, "You survived." It felt strange, almost sacred, as if the universe itself had been waiting for me to say it. Yes, I had been betrayed. Yes, I had lost the person I thought would stand beside me forever. But in losing him, I had found something far more powerful, myself. And that, I realized, was not an ending. It was the beginning of everything. If my story touched something inside you, if you have ever stayed when you should have walked away, or loved someone who only gave you pain, then let this be your reminder. You are not alone, and you are not weak for feeling deeply. Healing takes time, but strength always returns. So if you felt every word of this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, follow, and stay with me for more stories that remind you, no matter what breaks you, you can rise again.